And now I'd like to introduce, he gets after me for a while, once in a while for saying this, but I want to introduce you to the hottest Ed Ricketts researcher on the planet. And he happens to be the librarian at the Miller Library here at Hopkins University, and Hopkins Marine Station. It's been a long night and day. Why don't you just go ahead and do yours?
Do my spiel. And my spiel, I never know. One thing I do need to know is where is the clicker that forwards things?
It's right here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael Hemp. Thank you for always supporting my efforts. Thank you, the Cannery Row Foundation, for making all this happen. Thank you, Hopkins Marine Station and Stanford University, for hosting this. I had this great gig one time. Came here about 1992. My brother was doing his PhD on the influence of Joseph Campbell on pop culture, right? So he does his PhD, but while he's doing that, there's this opportunity that arises, which is to digitize and archive the letters of correspondence of Joseph Campbell. So I'm offered this opportunity. For about 2 or 3 years, I would travel up to San Anselmo and get a box or two of Ed Ricketts' correspondences or his clippings that he'd saved all his life. I'd return here to Pacific Grove and go through this project of digitizing all this material. This was on a UMax computer, which was a clone from the Mac. So this takes you back to 1994. And this is, Joseph Campbell had just passed away, maybe 87 or 88, and my brother and I kind of looked at each other, and my brother looks at me and says, we just showed up late for the party, right? And we're just trying to put all the pieces together and figure out what happened in the period of Joseph Campbell's life. So here I am again, late for the party, shall we say, right? So I come to Hopkins Marine Station in 1992. I don't wind up into the Miller Library till 2004, actually, is when I take a position as, I'm not the head librarian, I am branch library specialist 3, right? So I get into the library here at Hopkins Marine Station, the Miller Library, and I start working my way through the stacks, shelving books, and I have this bust of Ed Ricketts, right, that stares me in the face every day. And I start finding these books of Ed Ricketts, right? And how do I know they're the books of Ed Ricketts? Because there's Ed Ricketts' gift bookplate in these particular books. And they say gift of Ed Ricketts. So I look at Joe Weibel, who is then the head librarian, and I said, Joe, how many of these books do we have here at Hopkins Marine Station? He's like, I don't know, right? So I'm like, well, okay, I worked on Joe for a while. Time to move on to another project. Let's figure out what's in Ed. Since I have the bust of Ed's head, I need to figure out what's in Ed's head, right? So I start making a list, right? What's in Ed's scientific library? And I find bits and pieces scattered throughout the library. This is a scientific reprint, a scientific paper from his good friend Torsten Gisland, right, who had traced the study of marine sociology, marine ecology, in particular of intertidal zonation, as far back as 1812. You see the Pacific biological stamp on that? It tells me it's pieces of Ed that's scattered in my library. So I start putting this together. These are the bound reprints of Ed Ricketts. Pacific Biological Laboratories runs along the bottom. So I gather this material up and I put it in locked stacks, right? I want to kind of protect this material. Here's another shot of those bound reprints of Ed Ricketts, right? On the bottom, Pacific Biological Laboratories. On the top, papers of Pacific Coast selenerates, Pacific Coast malacology, Pacific Coast echinology. This is the work of Walter K. Fisher, then the director at Hopkins Marine Station. So I'm on my way, right? I got a new project. I gather all this material up. I put it online, edricketts.stanford.edu. I put his scientific interests together, his personal interests together the best I can as I'm building the story, figuring out what's in Ed's head, what informed Ed Ricketts, right? And I'm still finding stuff. I've been at this for 6 years. 4 months ago, in a box, in the library, I find about 13 pages of correspondence from Ed Ricketts to Walter K. Fisher, then director at Hopkins Marine Station, okay? So, with all this material, as I find important letters, I make sure it goes up to main campus in special collections. I don't keep it here. I get all those important papers and get them in the archives where they can handle them much better up at main campus. Here is his index reprint collection. Michael was telling you about the box of his Rolodex for his business. Well, we have his cards for his reprint collection. When Ricketts gets hit by the train, we know the fire happened in 1936, but we also know he has to do the Sea of Cortez, 1940. He's going to work on Between Pacific Tides, second revised edition until 1948. He's got to rebuild his library, right? Because he's got to get that phyletic catalog, the information for the Sea of Cortez back together again. He's got to update the revised edition of Between Pacific Tides. So when he got hit by the train, he had it in his will for the material to come to Hopkins Marine Station. Some of that scientific material went into the Miller Library. And I get to go through all this stuff and put it together. So here's another picture of the index reprint collection. Here's Pacific Biological Laboratory. There's that stamp. Cirripedia, right? Barnacles. So that's how he's going to catalog it. Here is an example of one of those index cards. Dora Henry, right? Notes on the Cecil, on some Cecil barnacles from Lower California and the west coast of Mexico. Then I find, amongst my reprint collection, that particular reprint. So I go again. Another one from Dora Henry. Cirripedia, barnacles, Dora's an invertebrate specialist, a taxonomist, a systemicist specializing in barnacles. The Cirripedia of Puget Sound with a key to the species. There it is in my library. So I have this wonderful collection. I'm able to put this material together. What's in Ed's head? What's informing him? And how does this fit in the story of Between Pacific Tides First Edition, Between Pacific Tides Revised Edition, and the Sea of Cortez? Now, let's just quickly review, right, Ed's labs. So, 1925, actually 1923, established the first Pacific Biological Laboratory in Pacific Grove, right, with his partner. Here is the second Pacific Biological Laboratory. He moves about 1928. Evidently, the first property was sold in Pacific Grove, and he was able to locate the property down here that sits along Cannery Row now, which was originally Ocean View Avenue back then. Keep an eye on that Packard, okay? Nice looking car, huh? There's that devastating fire, right? The second Pacific Biological Laboratory burns to the ground, November 25th, 1936. But what we're finding is some things survived that fire. Just like the Rolodex, all those 3 boxes, I think it is, Michael, of cards that basically tell all the correspondences or all the connections he had on the business end of it. We're also finding cards that are in my library that has to do with the surveys that he did. So when he would go collect animals in Monterey, as we're finding out today, he travels up and down the coast, going down to Ensenada, beginning in 1925, Laguna Beach, 1926, 1930, Balboa, beautiful time. Hood's Canal we're hearing today. The Ricketts family are going up there on an annual basis, right? So there's Pacific Biological Laboratory that we have today, okay? Okay, so we've reviewed the labs. Now, what about the cars that Ed Ricketts had, right? How did he go up and down the coast on all these trips? Well, I find one mention of the Big Mitchell, okay? And this is in Nan Ricketts' Recollections. And she writes, Big Mitchell, it was an oldie, but was very good to us, taking us on many beautiful trips and adventures. I'm like, okay, looks like he had the Big Mitchell. I don't have a picture of it, but let me try and put an example up for you, right? There's the Packard that he purchases in about 1925, right? A.E. Gallagher, Albert E. Gallagher, who was his first partner, his original partner for Pacific Biological Laboratory in 1923, had moved on to establish a laboratory up in Oakland. And Ed's got he's got a Packard as of 1925. He owns this until 1932. He writes to Torsten Gislin, right? I've put over 100,000 miles on this car, right? And in 7 years is my approximate. You can put all this together from bits and pieces of information in the first book, Between Pacific Tides. You can get from the survey cards that I have and that I've been gathering in the library. They're also posted on edricketts.stanford.edu. You can see who identifies species for Ricketts through those survey cards. That shows you that Ricketts is extremely well connected in the scientific community. Everybody that comes through Hopkins Marine Station, faculty, graduate students, undergraduates, and scientists from around the world, Ricketts is going to get connected with, right? And some of them are going to travel up and down the coast with him in the Packards, right? So there's his first Packard. There's the second Packard they owned, right? 1933 to 1937, 100,000 miles once again. Bruce Ayers, in his book, Inside Cannery Row, provides the following description of that Packard limousine. Now get a hoot of this. The Packard was an enormous 8-cylinder inline automobile, chauffeur-driven style, with the front and back sections separated by a vertical cracked-down window. The car was black, shiny, and had lots of chrome, and sported 2 huge tires in the front fender wells. It had been a great luxury car in its day. Ed had bought it from a bankrupt Pebble Beach estate. It had a fine black leather upholstery in the front and mohair in the back, with cut glass vases for flowers and even a phone with a buzzer that Gene and I had to try out, of course, right? What a car that must have looked like, right? Wouldn't we like to see how fine that car looked then? Look at that car. That's Ed's second, right? Another 100,000 miles. And what we've learned is he's up and down the coast on an annual basis, beginning in 1925 until probably 1936, 1937, using these Packards to visit Hood Canal, as had been mentioned earlier, the Olympic Peninsula on an annual basis, down to Laguna Beach, Ensenada. I mean, wouldn't you love to see Laguna Beach and Ensenada in 1925, 1926? It's nice to see it today. Okay, here's the next car, right? So in the fall of 37, Ed Ricketts traded his second Packard for a Ford V8. Has that for about 9 years. And this is the last car he owned, right? Purchased an old, noisy 1936 Buick Sport Coupe, a car in constant need of a repair. So along with everything else that's in my library, I've gone out and I've started looking for layers of correspondence with Ed Ricketts from around the world. I find layers at the Smithsonian Institute. I find layers at Harvard University. I find layers at California Academy of Science. I find layers over in Lund, right, in Sweden, Denmark. He's corresponding with everybody. He's extremely well connected because these are all invertebrate specialists that Ricketts needs. Because what's he doing going up and down the coast? He's catching his bread and butter species, that helped supply the business and pay for the business, just like Kevin Bailey, right? He goes down to Sea of Cortez, collects enough specimens to then sell and make $12,000 and potentially pay for that trip, which really doesn't. Ricketts is always broke. He's always spending his money not on liquor so much, not on beer so much, for building his library before the fire and after fire. That's Ed's bliss, right? So he's gone how many hundreds of thousands of miles? He has one last collecting trip to do, right? He's going to get steaks for dinner. He goes down 3 blocks, and the idea now, when we were visiting Ed Jr. says, well, Alice, which was the wife of Ed at the time, and Ed Jr. had gone out to Carmel Valley, and Ed Jr. was showing him how to take photographs with the camera. Ed Jr. said, well, I didn't drive the car that day, but it seemed to be driving fine. But you know what? Maybe we just ran out of gas. Maybe nobody looked at the gas gauge. I went, oh, another possibility of what happened on that day when he got struck by the train. Okay, so I've told you about the index cards. Now we're jumping to the survey cards, which I have for Alaska, Monterey, Southern California, Baja California, right? Southern California, Mexico is the second box of these collecting cards that I have, the survey cards that show you the specimens he's collected up and down the coast. Here we have 13 April 1925. It was dredged in Santa Cruz. It's identified by Walter K. Fisher in 1925. So almost as soon as Ricketts gets here, he's hanging down at Hopkins Marine Station, connecting with everybody. Can you identify this for me? Can you tell me what that species is for me? Going from one person to another. And to the point where Walter K. is like, well, I don't know. I'm not an expert in that particular genre. For barnacles, you know, you'll have to send it to Dora. So he'd send specimens off. That's how he gets connected with the Smithsonian Institution, the United States National Museum, and he becomes good friends with Waldo Schmidt. Beginning in 1925, he's sending specimens off to be identified. And in return, they would send the scientific reprints to him, right, to help build his library so he could then write between Pacific tides. Okay, so this one's March 22nd, 1928, identified by, or collected by Chin Yip, okay? So Chin Yip's one of those names that keeps on showing up over the cards over and over again. Like, who's Chin Yip, right? Well, Wave Street Studios is here. Wave Street Studio lives in the house that's Kwok Moy's tea room, where Kwok Moy used to live. Kwok Moy was a member of the, with the family, lived at the Chinese fishing village here in Pacific Grove. Her brother is Tuck Lee, who I have a few paragraphs on, at least probably a whole chapter on in seaside.stanford.edu on the history of Hopkins Seaside Laboratory. His photograph is on that rock. When you're going down to visit the party that we're having tonight, look at the rock, you'll see Tuck Lee. Tuck Lee is Chin Yip's uncle. Kwok Moy is Chin Yip's mother. Chin Yip lived at Wave Street Studios. So you see this community, right, in Pacific Grove, and all these interactions are taking place, just like the story Cannery Row. Ed's connected to everybody. You start looking at those survey cards and who identified what, and I just started putting them together. Oh my God, he knows Henry Bigelow. He knows Gislin. Gislin and he traveled up and down the coast together in 1931 in the Packard. O'Donohue, he knows Vaughn. Vaughn becomes director of Scripps Institution of Oceanography. He just knows everybody. I mean, he's got a big Facebook page, right? He's got a lot of friends on that Facebook page. Here's the faculty, students, and other scientists just in general that I've kind of just pulled together. This is a small crumb of a list, right? Ira E. Cornwall, specialist in barnacles. He would check in on the Pacific Biological Laboratories for a few hours every day while Ricketts is down in the Sea of Cortez. He's helping things run during that 6-week period when Ricketts is away. So Ira E. Cornell was at Hopkins Marine Station for a number of different years where he identified a vast majority of barnacles from the U.S. National Museum that they would like him to identify. He's a specialist in barnacles. Just one example. Okay, so between Pacific tides, Ricketts and Calvin, account of the habits and habitats of some 500 of the common conspicuous seashore invertebrates Pacific coast, Sitka, Alaska to northern Mexico. So we're laying it out, right? He's got to go all the way down past Ensenada. He's got to get his way all the way up to Sitka, Alaska, right? And do a survey of all this so he can put the book together, Between Pacific Tides. Here's a little story from the Monterey Peninsula Herald. Ed Ricketts covers the waterfront for 20 years. I went out myself on the boats occasionally, often with the results not encouraging to delicate stomachs, scoured the bay in a rowboat for jellyfish and other floating organisms, got curious animals even from the San Francisco drag boats. Again, very troubled by the famous indisposition related to small boats and bad weather. He gets seasick real easy, right? I don't know how he did Gulf of California. Collected in the wilderness down the coast and made long trips into Mexico, Canada, Alaska, coming back each time to a larger town. Every time he goes away for 3 months, he comes back to Monterey and it's grown. And he's gone for this period of time. I always thought he was hanging out here running the Pacific Biological Laboratories. Joseph Campbell writes him a letter, says, hey, I'm coming out this summer. You going to be around? He's like, hey, if it's summertime at Pacific Grove, likely I'm not going to be here. He's up in Puget Sound area, the Olympic Peninsula, Hood's Canal. Okay, here we are, Ensenada, 11 May 1925. Wow. Let's go visit where Ed went, shall we? Just take a minute and see what he saw. Estero de Punta, Banda, Mexico. Another picture. Punta Banda. He's hanging out here almost on an annual basis, collecting those rare and other species, and at the same time doing a survey of the coastline, putting pieces together for Between Pacific Tides. The halfway house keeps showing up in the cards. I'm like, what's the halfway house? Am I ever going to find out this halfway house that's halfway between Tijuana and Ensenada? So, thank God for Google. Because I do a little searching on the halfway house and there it shows up. I'm like, the halfway house actually exists? There is really a place? So people have been there. All right, the halfway house exists, right? So it's 25 kilometers south of Rosarito. The legendary halfway house between Tijuana and Ensenada at Highway 1, opened as a cantina, 1922. It's still there, right? There's the back view from the halfway house today. Okay, now we're going down. We can go to Laguna Beach, right? 1930. Laguna Beach, into the wilderness. The road less traveled. Ed Ricketts, in many ways, shapes, and forms, takes the road less traveled. Ed Ricketts' pathway to bliss, right? The intertidal zone. There are some wonderful collecting areas around Laguna Beach, La Jolla, Newport. That's from Nan Ricketts in her book, Recollections. Here's Laguna Beach, Highway 1, 1940. Man, I want to go. Again, Laguna Beach, 1940. Here we are, Newport, February, November, 1930. Ricketts is down there. Here's it in the 1920s. There's nothing down there. There's Newport today. Here we are, Mission Bay, San Diego, California, 1925. He's down there. Another aerial, 1930. There we are today. Then you can start going through collecting cards that are available at the California Academy of Sciences. Shows him July 1st, 1930, Comox, Canada, right? He's with Calvin. They had written, or it was stated in a letter that's at Stanford University Press that says, hey, they just came back, or they're going on a trip to Canada. And that states they just came back from Canada in 1930. Here's what Comox, Canada looks like that they visited in 1930. Then you can go and you can find, they're visiting 3 weeks later, July 25th, 1930, Port Townsend, west of the lighthouse. This is from a Smithsonian invert department, right? Their collection cards, collections that were deposited by Ricketts. He sent in specimens. Here's the photograph of Jack Calvin taken July 30th at that Port Wilson Lighthouse, Port Townsend, Washington. Ed Ricketts Jr. very much put this story together. I didn't even know I was onto it until Pat Hathaway calls me from Ed Jr. and says, hey, what's this going on about Port Townsend 1930? I'm like, yeah, I think I found something like that. Those guys sitting together said, this is it, right? This is the time that he went up to Port Townsend. So this gives us an idea that this is annual trips. Again, he's for the bread and butter species. He's paying for his trips up and down the coast for surveys by collecting the bread and butter species. Okay. The publishing of Between Pacific Tides, first edition. So I've collected all these letters, right, from around the world, all these invertebrate specialists. And then somebody suggests, Don, what about letters of correspondence with Stanford University Press? Maybe they have some letters of correspondences. So I send this letter to Stanford University Press, and they say, I never thought I was going to hear anything. And they're like, we have letters. We have 3 folders of letters. I'm like, oh my God. So we got those materials down, and I've been going through those, took those letters, deposited them up at the Stanford Archive, right? But this gives me the story. What happened? So Ed Ricketts, actually Jack Calvin, seems to be the first person to approach Stanford University Press for this idea for a book, and they love it. They love the writing. They love the work. They love that's written on a layman's level, popularization of science. But there's one big problem. Myrtle Johnson and James Snook published this book in 1927, and it was subsidized by Mrs. Ellen Browning Scripps, right? They're like, we love your book. But you know what the big problem was? It got into the illustrations, how much the fancy photographs and all the line drawings were going to cost. They looked at that and said, Ed, we love your book, but man, we're going to go broke. How many people are going to buy this? You've got this fantastic book by Myrtle Johnson already out that's laid out in a phylogenetic manner. So here's a picture real fast of 1920. Myrtle Johnson's in this photograph. This is what Hopkins Marine Station looked like, the Agassiz building. And here we are with Walter K. Fisher, right? And he's been the one that's been accused of holding up the publication of Between Pacific Tides because he writes these negative, derogatory, condescending reviews. They're critical reviews. Ricketts is going to have to abide by some of the critical reviews that Walter K. Fisher suggests. The Stanford University Press pay very much attention to the publishing or the reviews of Fisher? Not too much. So timeline, March 1930. This is timeline for the publication Between Pacific Tides. Calvin approaches SUP with the idea for a book. 32, SUP requests $2,000 subsidy for the book because Myrtle book got subsidized. June and August, they already know on the trip that they've been cut out, you know, or they have to get a subsidy. He tries to get the subsidy. He doesn't. He fails at it, right? He asks everybody to buy, from a university, buy a copy at $100 or 2 copies at $100. Get 20 of them, you got $2,000. Last communication with the press, Ed Ricketts, right, is 1932. But then, May 13th, 1935, the next communication by the press with Ed Ricketts, a lapse of 2 years, 7 months, and 3 days. Here comes a letter from Stanford University Press. Oh, no, it's not on this one. What he does, right, is Stanford University Press starts getting these orders for this book, A Natural History of Pacific Shore Invertebrates. This is Ed Ricketts' covert advertising campaign. Unbeknownst to Stanford University Press, he does a pre-publication notice that says, hey, if you want this book, let Pacific Biological Laboratories know, or fill this form out and let Stanford University know, and it'll become of no charge. When it's done, we'll send you the book, right, once you pay for it. amongst all those cards in the index, the Rolodex that Michael Hemp comes in, he brings out all these boxes, and then I look at these and I just start cracking up. I'm like, oh no, another piece of the story. So not only did I find this piece, which is already in San Jose State University's archives, right, the pre-publication notes, he had this nice little piece put together, right, the business reply. Please enter my pre-publication order for how many copies? Rickets and Calvin, $7.50 each. Susan Schillinglaw pointed this out to me. She said, Don, $7.50 in 1939, that's expensive. Okay, so I'm getting cut off, and that's the story for just the first edition. I have 2 manuscripts in prep. Probably won't get accepted because I can't find enough people to buy the book, right? Which is Stanford University Press says, it's a great book, Don, but who's going to buy it, right? Just like they do with Between Pacific Tides. So in 1939, it finally gets published, right? First edition, 1,000 copies. Ed says, oh man, he writes at Stanford University Press, I forgot to thank Richie Lovejoy for the line drawings in the first edition. So let's all thank Richie Lovejoy today for the line drawings in the first edition of Between Pacific Tides. That's an abbreviated story. Well, they like to record you. That's the whole reason. Yeah, they're capturing the question.
Ricketts obviously worked long and hard, but he was known as a man who wasn't only working. He was known as the Renaissance man, music, art.
He's into it.
Philosophy, women.
He's got it.
I don't know if any of his personal records, correspondence were mixed in with all this, or did he have a good filing system and keep them separate?
That's a good question. I think he keeps them separate, right? So his correspondences, communication is very much of his gathering information for Between Pacific Tides to connect who identified what for him when, who offered him suggestions. He had to have portions of Between Pacific Tides reviewed by an enormous number of invertebrate specialists before it would be accepted. So I assume he definitely keeps everything separate. And Ricketts is meticulous, right? I mean, that's what we're seeing is the cards demonstrate that.
Is the personal stuff stored somewhere publicly that we know of?
There's the personal stuff that I know of. There's a good portion of at Stanford University in special collections. Richard?
Don, what's the history of Johnson and Snook? What happened to it? How long? How long was its lifespan?
That's a really good question. And when I'm working through the second edition, Between Pacific Tides, it rears its head again, right? It's like 10 years later, it's going, or maybe 20 years later. And there's going to be the second printing of Johnson and Snooks. And they want to get Between Pacific Tides revised edition out before it has to compete again in 1948. I think it has a lifespan until 1968. And it's a wonderful book. It identifies 500 of the most common invertebrates along the coast. Beautiful line drawings in it, several photographs in it. It's a wonderful piece of work, but it was not done on the writing of pop culture. And that's the audience that Ricketts wants to get to. The letter that he writes to Walter K. Fisher, there's nothing wrong with the popularization of science as long as it's done decently. And this is in the letter that he asked Walter K. Fisher if he would write the preface to Between Pacific Tides. And I'm like, oh my God. He was asked to write the preface and he didn't. Larry?
Yeah. Don, when I was visiting last, I think you showed me a book called Between the Tides, which was an Eastern book. And I wonder if you'd comment on, you've just gotten it, I think, and I wonder if you'd comment on what you learned about that.
Thank you for that question, Larry. So Between the Tides, that's why that name gets changed, right? I showed you the previous, this title. A Natural History of Pacific Shore Invertebrates. Well, originally started as Between Pacific Tides, but then Between the Tides came out by this guy named Crowder. And Ricketts writes William Harley Davis at Stanford University, and he says, hey, this is just too close. We should probably change the name. So that's why it gets changed. Years go by. Publication's about to come out again, 1937. It's like, can we change the name back to Between Pacific Tides? So I have the book, Between the Tides. It's another wonderful book based on the Atlantic, right? But organized in a taxonomic manner, right? Not organized according to habitat.
In your research, what did you find out about his relationship with the Chinese community along Cannery Row?
I think, oh, so the question is, what's Ricketts' relationship with the Chinese community in Pacific Grove? His Chinyep is your uncle, or no, grandfather. Her grandfather collects for Ricketts for probably 20 years. He writes, I believe to somebody, I can't remember when, that the old Chinaman, the Chinaman's getting old. He can't collect for me. So one of his principal collectors who helped him organize and gather all the material is going away. But in that same piece, in the Monterey Herald, he talks about not only your grandfather, but your great-granduncle, Tuck Lee. He knows this great-grandfather, right, and the collection of hagfish embryos. So Ricketts, like I think the whole community, which we really haven't paid much attention to, are interrelated, interconnected with that Chinese community and always have been. Any more questions? Can I go home? Okay.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you, Michael.